Welcome and good morning. I want to start this event by sharing with you a land acknowledgement. I know many of you know I've been involved with the Kumeyaay for quite a while, but I just want to remind you that they were the first people who lived in this area, and they seeded, tended, revitalized, and basically lived sustainably on this land that we are on now. They lived really well in between the two watersheds that we are surrounded by. And I just wanted you to acknowledge that as we go on throughout this day. Basically, we're going to be learning a whole lot about our ecosystem, and I'd like you to be thinking about the Native Americans who lived here and preserved it for us. Okay, welcome, and our mayor, Tracy Martinez, is going to welcome you formally. She's coming up here.
Good morning, everybody. It is a true pleasure to have the privilege to greet everybody in this amazing community affair. You know, when I came to this town almost 15 years ago, I knew it was special. But getting to know the community, we really are special. We really take care of our community, and I think we're stewards of it. And we're going to learn today how to be better stewards of it. Because as climate changes, we need to support and learn to protect, and in some cases adapt. And I think this group is dedicated to not only doing that, many are doing that, but also educating others on how to do that. So welcome, everybody. I also wanted to thank Carol Carriage. This was her vision. Her vision was to do this great symposium and to bring the community together. And I think she's achieved that through a lot of hard work. I also want to support, I also want to bring attention to organizations here within our community that support this mission. The Sustainability Committee, the Lagoon Committee, Parks and Rec Committee, and I'm looking at, and the Garden Club, of course. You were on my list, and also the nonprofits who are on the program that support this community as well. But this wouldn't have been possible without the Del Mar Foundation. As you know, they do amazing things for this city, and this is just another example of their support for today. So thank you.
All right. Last piece of logistics, if you don't have a program yet, please pick one up. It tells you the biographical information on the speakers. We're not going to take a lot of time to do that in introducing them. We'd rather have them just talk to you. So with that, let's get started. Our very first speaker, we're very privileged to have Dr. Ralph Keeling, who I will say this is the son of Dave Keeling, who is the founder of the Keeling Curve and the general chairperson of our community plan. So he comes from a distinguished Del Mar family. Ralph, come on up.
All right, thanks Dwight, and thanks to all of you for showing up. And you know, it's a great honor to be given a speaking slot here. I grew up in this town, so I have a perspective on it from having lived here. I also have a famous father who played a big role in putting the topic of climate change in the public arena and fleshing out details. And I myself followed in his footsteps. So I own a little bit of that space. So I guess it's reasonable for me to talk here. So what I'm going to be trying to do is paint some of the big picture of the story of climate change and my perspective on it. This is stemming from the kind of work I do at UCSD, and it's the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. It comes from continuing the curve that my father started called the Keeling curve. Does that ring any bells? A curve of rising carbon dioxide, right? Up and up and up, sadly. This perspective is informed by thinking about the big picture. And when my father started on this work, he was really the only person working in the field. I mean, he kind of launched the field. And the topics of discussion were really big picture questions, like how the world was going to respond. Was it going to respond? How was carbon dioxide going to keep going up? What were the controls on it? So this is a perspective that I come from. And of course, the the field has increased enormously, and now it comes full circle, because here I am talking about climate impacts in the town I grew up in. So it's like something that was abstract and in the distant future for decades now suddenly is here in front of us. And of course, there's a fear factor that's come in because of events in the last years and decades. So people are very aware and they're very concerned, and that's of course a very important topic to talk about. The perspective I bring is a little bit of an ivory tower perspective, in the sense that it's kind of abstract and maybe almost full of platitudes. I will also say that it's sadly kind of depressing. I mean, the message from the ivory tower is not a happy message, it's a depressing message. And so how does one start from a perspective, wow, this is a serious problem, and what are we going to do about it, and a kind of a hopelessness, to a transition to engagement and how to actually move forward in ways that are sensible. So that's a challenge I face, and I think it's a challenge we all face. So I apologize if this message comes across as kind of hopeless and depressing, because at some level this problem is a very difficult problem. So the perspective from a kind of a framing is to think of the climate problem as two categories of things that people can do. They can take actions to reduce the severity of the problem, called mitigation. This is reducing the overall climate impacts. And second, you can take actions that are preparing locally or at another scale, like a national scale or a county scale for the impacts. And that would be something that we call adaptation, or now it's going under the buzzword resilience or resilience preparedness. So I'm going to say a little bit about both sides of that aspect. So what is the concern about, where does the problem really come from, and what would we have to do to solve the problem? Well, in a nutshell, I mean, there's a lot of aspects to it, but the big issue is fossil fuel burning. So the reason CO2 is building up, there's a number of factors involved, but the overwhelming strong reason it's building up is we're burning fossil fuels. And in order to reduce the problem and get it back under control, we have to cut our emissions. We really have to cut them drastically. When I say we, I mean the whole world. So you get a sense of the scale of the issue here. And there's complexities involved. The carbon dioxide goes in the atmosphere, it spreads in other reservoirs, and the carbon dioxide traps heat, but it takes a while for the world to warm up. There are leads and lags, and it can get kind of complicated. But there is a simple framing that's an okay way to think about it. And that is, it's almost like carbon dioxide is just building up and causing damage. It's like putting trash in a landfill. The more you put there, the more it piles up. It's a cumulative problem. So the measure of how far we're into this and how deep it is how much we've dumped into the air. And in details, it works like this. Some of what we put up there will spread elsewhere, but it takes a while for that carbon dioxide to have its warming impact. And so it's as if the warming impact happened on day one and was locked in. So when we emit more CO2, we're kind of locking in permanent climate change. So every time you drive your car or go in an airplane, you're locking in effectively permanent damage to the Earth system. And this is one reason there's one of the targets that we want to get to is called net zero. What's net zero? Net zero is the point where we're no longer dumping CO2 into the air. That's the point at which the problem is no longer getting worse. I want you to absorb that. Net zero is the point at which the problem is no longer getting worse. It's not the point that we're back to some kind of baseline. It's when we've stabilized at some kind of new baseline. It might not be a place we want to be either, which is why people are talking about even more pie in the sky things like scrubbing CO2 in the air or spraying the stratosphere with aerosols, something I don't particularly like. There's a lot of crazy ideas out there. But that's why people are even engaged at that level. And of course, getting to net zero is going to be very hard because we're so dependent on fossil fuels. So in terms of what a town like Del Mar could do to help this, obviously it's a global problem. But the main hope we have of getting there is renewables And I think one of the main roles that a city like Del Mar can do, and I think it's already doing this to the extent that there's good ideas and traction, is just to support the renewable transition. And that's not just solar and everything else, it's infrastructure changes that allow people to live well without using as much energy. So it's a lot of it comes down to infrastructure. But the other key point is that to the extent that the world acts on mitigation, it's not going to save us from major consequences. So this is why the conversation pivots over to a conversation about adaptation. So, and this comes down to we want to know what's coming and we want to get ready for it. So we need to know what's coming as part of the science and the preparedness. And some of this is already pretty clear. It's clear it's going to get warmer. Right? It's clear we're going to have stronger heat waves because the atmosphere carries more water. We can have stronger storms. There's sea level is going to rise inevitably, and it's going to keep rising for a very long time, maybe at a slow rate, but kind of this elephant in the room. And the other thing I'd say is that some of these impacts are really not very visible yet. And I think one of the lessons of the story is that by the time we start seeing real impacts, it's going to be too late to stop much bigger impacts. So unfortunately, there's a problem where you can't really wait for these things to show up, because when they show up, they're there, and they just grow and grow and grow. And fire, you know, the one that's really evident is the increase in wildfire. It's very concerning. And we're almost certainly going to see more of that because of the way the warming interacts with drought and combustibility. Now, there's also a lot of things we probably don't know about what's happening. And wildfire is an example of that. 20 years ago, it wasn't really on the list of things it wasn't one of the boxes people were checking as a concern about climate change. And now it's really big. There may be others like that we haven't really come to the foreground yet. I can speculate. I mean, I can imagine some wave of invasive species or some new disease vector that's out there that suddenly changes how people have to live. All of those things are possible. The other thing to say is that the climate problem is huge, but how it's perceived and how we deal with it is going to be layered on top of all sorts of other issues that are going on. And in fact, if I look around at this town and how it's changed since I was a kid, I mostly see things that are not climate change. They're huge changes, like all the development east of the freeway and beyond. I even remember when Del Mar Heights was built. So I have a perspective on this infinite chaparral-scape going east that's now basically paved and developed. Huge change. It's changed how people behave. It's changed. We became urban. We became part of a big city instead of a little town outside of a city. In terms of the landscape, I mean, you see bluff erosion, you see the loss of beach sand. These are all big changes. I doubt they have very much to do with climate change, at least so far. Even changes in the natural setting. When I was a kid, there were jellyfish everywhere. They were the terror of the water. I mean, I haven't seen one of these purple jellyfishes maybe once every couple of years. Now the stingrays are everywhere. Right? What's going on? Climate change? I doubt it. I mean, one of my good friends from Scripps, John McGowan, some of you may know him, studied ecology, and I was talking with him about this kind of thing, and he said, nah, it's just what happens. Things come and go. So some of these things just happen on their own. I remember there were grackles everywhere, these little black birds. They're all gone. And my parents have this wonderful backyard that I grew up in Del Mar. I remember there used to be little blue butterflies everywhere. Does anyone remember these little blue butterflies? They're all over the place. I mean, I think in the last 20 years, I've seen one when I went on a hike east here. They completely disappeared, except for one place. There's a nice collection of on pins in the little house in Torrey Pines Park. Okay, so if you want to see what you're missing, they're on pins. Where did they go? I have no idea, but I suspect it has to do with loss of chaparral. Not really sure. And then, of course, the Argentine ants, they just took over. They wiped out everything. When they came, there was just massive. These are not climate change, but climate change is going to be layering on these other kind of changes that are going to be happening anyway. And in this context that climate change is layering on things, I mean, the one way to think of climate change is not this singular challenge that we have to address. It's more a dimension to every piece of long-term planning has to think about, is this climate ready? Is this worthy for the future? And there's a kind of a problem of awareness and perception about this, because the changes are slow. So you can look over 10 or 20 years and feel like not much has happened. But yet, if you go 30, 40 years, you can see massive changes. And so it's easy to, I mean, I think right now you get heightened awareness because there were wildfires or whatever, and it's in the news. But maybe there'll be another 5 years where there's less in the news, and it sort of recedes again. We shouldn't let that happen. These are big changes, and we have to sort of be aware of the slow, steady nature of this. And I want to point to this picture here as an example of something that I think when I was growing up, if I had been shown this picture, I wouldn't have had the slightest inkling that it was a picture of Del Mar. That's not what the beach at Del Mar looked like. It didn't look anything like that. I mean, the estuaries were not open. They were massively plugged up with sand, except in maybe a massive river runoff event. So you can see a bit of the future here. Sea level is going to go up. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if 100 years or 150 years from now, Del Mar doesn't talk about having a marina, right? Because you can see what's happening. The ocean is just spilling around there in a way that it didn't before. That's not sea level rise, I suspect. That's probably mainly loss of sand. But sea level rise is going to layer on top of that. And the town has to think about how to deal with this and how its identity is going to be shaped by the changing landscape. So I think that's probably where I should step down here. I hope I did okay. Anyway, thank you, Ralph.
What a privilege it is to have Ralph and his family be Del Mar residents for such a long time. And our next speaker, we are continuing in this vein, is Mark Merriman from Scripps Institute, and you can read about his bio in the program. Mark, take it away.
Okay. Well, that's getting teed up. I just wanted to acknowledge that Scripps has had a long, strong partnership with Del Mar. A lot of faculty live in Del Mar and have taken active role here. Dr. Tara Gasterlin being one of the more notable ones. And Del Mar has also done a lot to support Scripps. And so the center I'm involved with came about due to a generous donation from Dick and Carol Hertzberg, who are residents of Del Mar here today. So I just wanted to acknowledge them and thank them. So I guess my main message is don't follow a chemist in this talk. He's going to suck up all the oxygen in the room here. I just want to hit a couple of points that he did, and also start to give you a sense of what data you have available. Some of it is just the national report sort of data sets. Other is that you're sort of a partner with Scripps, and so we have some information that I think will be useful going forward. This is just the tide gauge that it reflects the sea level rise here in Del Mar, just to note that it is matching global sea level rise averaged over the whole planet. So what's happening here very much is what's happening everywhere. And the challenge is then what's going to happen in the future. There's a national report that came out, federal report, about 3 years ago. This is sort of the definitive take on what sea level is going to be looking like in the future. These different curves here correspond to different scenarios where we're going to be in terms of fossil fuel usage in the future. But you can see where we are in 2020. By mid-century, all those curves are still intermingling. So we're committed to sea level rise no matter what path we take. And then toward the ends of the century is when we're going to see a big change depending on what our choice is in terms of mitigation. But those are sobering numbers, something like 1 to 2 feet above 2000 by the middle of the century, maybe getting them to 3 to 4 by the end of the century. There are a lot of tools that can be used for this. This is the Cosmos. This is just one particular one showing what will happen if sea level increases by 3 feet. These are mainly useful, I think, for just giving you a lay of the land. What part of the land is lowest and what part is most susceptible to sea level rise going forward, but lots of nice products associated with that. Scripps has maintained a monitoring program at Del Mar for the last 3 years. Every week we go out with a LiDAR and map the cliffs and beaches of Del Mar. Mostly the cliffs. This is Adam Young, who's leading this project, trying to understand what the vulnerability is of the cliffs below the coaster there. Over that time period, this is the retreat that's been measured. So just this spans Del Mar, and you can see just about every place along the coast has had some cliff retreat on the order of maybe half a meter, some places getting up above a meter, but it's happening everywhere. This is a study by Adams showing why it's happening. The area in the blue, this is the why, the up and down here is elevation. And then what the curve is telling you is what's causing erosion at different elevations up the cliff face. The blue is rain. So you can see the number one issue for cliffs here is heavy rain. And so part of the climate change signal that Del Mar needs to be cognizant of is what's going to happen with AR events in the future, what's the projection there. And generally it's that extreme events are going to get more extreme. Not necessarily more frequent, but the big, strong events are going to be continuing to hit the area. The lower part of the cliff, you can see these purple, yellow, red lines. These are due to waves. So the rain is causing the weight of the cliff to increase, causing slumping. The waves are causing the undercutting. The waves are going up as sea level rises. So that's the big issue for it. Also, you want to protect those cliff bases as much as possible, so it's the width of the beach, which is really the critical issue for maintaining these cliffs. Scripps is putting together an early warning system for cliff failure. One of those beta testing stages is in Del Mar, so you may see this coming out in the future, but this is information that gives you a heads up that a particular part of the shoreline is unstable. The beaches. So as I said, we've been monitoring the cliffs, but also the beaches. And so going back to 2017, the red line is how North Del Mar, the width of Del Mar beach has been changing. Blue is South Del Mar. And so North Del Mar has actually been growing in width over the last, 6, 7 years. If you look at that on a much longer time scale, we can do this with satellites. Upper one is North Del Mar, bottom one is South Del Mar. When that thing is going down, the beach is getting narrower. When it's going up, it's getting wider. So you can see that North Del Mar has had the bit that I'm saying is widening is just that little, I don't think I can point to it there. The very end there where it's starting to take an uptick on the top panel, that's where it's been increasing. Otherwise, it's been decreasing for decades. That curve on the upper one is very similar to what all of Southern California has been doing. So it's not just Del Mar that's been experiencing this, it's all of Southern California. And it's really not so much a climate change signal, but a climate variation signal. There's something called a Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is causing waves to wane and wax over decadal periods. That's, we think, what's driving this main change, but this kind of information is really important for assessing how to respond. Prior to these last few years, it would look pretty dour where all of the beaches, or at least the North Beach, was rapidly decreasing, but that's since turned around since the last El Nino. When you do see there is a kind of a sad point to this though. So even though it's widening, we just got hit in January by these AR events. So the beach, as you probably know, just walking on the beach, is narrower for this time of year than usual. This is one of the narrowest beaches for this part of the winter that we've seen over the record. The red is showing where the sand used to be, the blue is showing where it went. So all that sand that used to be on the beach is being pushed offshore. So right now, heading into, unfortunately, an El Nino year, which we know is a heavy storm year, we're concerned that we're at our weakest point, that we've pushed all the sand offshore, and now we expect big waves to come in this winter to really cause some havoc. So there might be some permanent loss of sand from the system, just associated with the timing of these storms. That AR event was a big one, and the impact of that was sort of comparable to an El Nino event. I think that might be the last one, yeah. So I just want to end by saying that adaptation is going to rely on the best available data. And I just want to emphasize that Del Mar, through Scripps and partnerships with us, we're looking to supply you with the best information we can. And we see Del Mar as sort of a test ground for adaptation. There's a lot to protect here, a lot at stake. and the choices you make will have a profound impact for the generations to come. So.
All right, everybody take a deep breath. You've heard overview of climate change and what's going on, and now we're going to turn our attention to what's more specific to Del Mar. And there will be a question and answer session after the first round of speakers, so if you have questions, please try to remember them or write them down, and we'll hopefully get them answered for you. So our next speaker is Jonathan Applebaum, who is a very respected local ecologist and knowledgeable in essentially everything. And you can read about him in the program as well. So Jonathan, where are you? Come on up.
Well, thank you, Dwight, for that introduction. It is an honor to be here today to speak to you all about the biodiversity of Del Mar and the other features that make Del Mar such a unique place, as well as to set the stage for our amazing lineup of speakers. I'm Jonathan Applebaum, a resource ecologist, former conservation manager for the San Diego River Valley Conservancy and current contract biologist. I'm also with the Volcan Mountain Foundation in Julian. And I want to also give thanks to the folks who very graciously have allowed me to use their photographs in my presentation today. So, as we're speaking about climate change, I think it's critical that we talk about what's at stake. On a global scale, we know, for example, that we are losing our polar ice caps. We face possible extinction of polar bears. But what about locally? What about here? Some of you may have heard that San Diego County is the most diverse county in the most diverse state in the contiguous 48 states. And Del Mar is a particularly biodiverse part of San Diego County. Well, what kind of leads to, what gives this area so much biodiversity? And there are really four main things. First, there are a lot of conserved lands. We're virtually surrounded by conserved lands, as you'll see in the next slide. We have a lot of sensitive natural communities, actually a disproportionate amount of sensitive natural communities to our area size. We have a disproportionately large number of rare, threatened, and endangered species relative to our size. And we're within the coastal zone. So we've got the interface of marine resources, terrestrial resources, and the interface. We also have some unique regulatory and management challenges from being within a coastal zone. So, Del Mar, as you know, is bounded on the north by the San Diego Lagoon and on the south by Los Penasquitos. The San Diego Lagoon includes the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Ecological Reserve, as well as being included as part of a state marine resource conservation area. Los Penasquitos is a state natural reserve, and it's administered by state parks as part of Torrey Pines State Park. Just over the hill here, you get to Crest Canyon. And Crest Canyon is an established multiple species conservation plan preserve. So it's really critical to meeting some of the objectives of the county's multiple species conservation plan. And then you've got, as I mentioned, Torrey Pines State Park and the Torrey Pines State Extension. So as you can imagine, we are virtually surrounded by conserved lands. We also have a disproportionate amount of sensitive natural communities for our area. I've listed 6 here. I want to really focus on 2 to illustrate. We have Torrey Pines woodland. Torrey pines only naturally occur in 2 locations on Earth. One is on Santa Rosa Island. The other is here coastally in North Coastal San Diego County. Nowhere else. Everywhere else, they're transplanted. We've got southern maritime chaparral. We've got Diegan coastal sage scrub and all of the species that inhabit coastal sage scrub. We've got coastal salt marsh. And according to the Monterey Bay Aquarium, since 1850, California has lost 90% of its coastal wetlands. It's only 10% left. So it is well represented here in the Del Mar area. We've got coastal bluffs and dunes, which are obviously facing rapid retreat because of intensification of storms. And we have maritime succulent scrub. So we have a disproportionate number of these sensitive natural communities and the species that depend on them. We have a disproportionate number of rare, threatened, and endangered species. And I'll start with the highest tier of those, endangered. Those that are listed as endangered by the federal government, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, or by the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. We have and those are at risk of extinction if dramatic action is not taken. We have California least tern in the lower left. We have light-footed ridgeways rail, which is incredibly difficult to say, in the top there. The San Dieguito River is actually identified as critical habitat in the recovery plan for southern steelhead trout, and it's a core 2 population. We have over in Crest Canyon, federally endangered Del Mar manzanita. We also have a couple of very small annuals like Orca spineflower and short-leaved Dudleya, which are so diminutive, if you're not looking with your magnifying glass, you'll probably miss them. But they're so restricted in range. That's why this area becomes so important for the preservation of biodiversity. A tier down from endangered are listed threatened species. Many of you are familiar with the call of the California gnatcatcher, which whines like a kitten from the coastal sage scrub. We've got this cute little guy, the Belding Savannah sparrow, which likes pickleweed salt marshes. Again, we've lost 90% of our coastal wetlands and salt marshes, so it's pretty restricted. And every once in a while, we'll see a tricolored blackbird passing through. And then finally, we have several species that are not at the tier of state or federal listing, but are sensitive. Species of special concern, like the northern harrier. We have recreational and game fish. Pacific halibut use the lagoons as nurseries for their young. California grunion will run on our beaches on a warm summer night around the new or the full moons. We have lots of other sensitive species. We have a plant called the Del Mar sand aster, the aforementioned Torrey pine, Nuttall scrub oak, California brown pelicans, which have been delisted from the endangered species list, but were listed previously because we got rid of DDT and some other actions. We've got ospreys, and if you're ever over near the fairgrounds in the parking lot, you'll see those towers where the ospreys fledge a couple of chicks every year, it seems. And we've got some other cool species like the long-billed curlew, which likes our salt marshes. We are also within the coastal zone. And as they say in real estate, it's all about location, location, location. And Del Mar's got it, right? But we also have some regulatory hurdles and things like that. We are within the coastal zone, and so the city has a local coastal program which governs some development-related issues. All state tidelands are actually within the jurisdiction of the California State Lands Commission. And again, since we're in the coastal zone, we can encounter marine mammals at our beaches, or we can encounter what are called anadromous fish in our wetlands. We're also often interfacing with the National Oceanographic and Administrative Administration's National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's National Marine Fisheries Service. And they can bring several resources to bear that actually are beneficial. So what threats are we facing? There's the aforementioned sea level rise. We'll run through a little bit of that. We've got the intense storm events. We have wildfires. And then there are some less obvious things like phenological shifts and changing migration patterns, which I'll illustrate. So we've heard a little bit about sea level rise. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. By 2050, sea level along contiguous U.S. coastlines could rise as much as 12 inches or 30 centimeters above today's waterline, according to researchers who analyzed nearly 3 decades of satellite observations. So that's coming from NASA, and that was in 2022. And then they also say, or NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, says about 2 feet of sea level rise along the U.S. coastline is increasingly likely between 2020 and 2100 because of emissions to date. And this gets to what Drs. Keeling and Dr. Merrifield were saying. Failing to curb future emissions could cause an additional 1.5 to 5 feet. That's 1/2 to 1.5 meters of rise for a total of 3.5 to 7 feet by the end of the century. I'm going to illustrate that for you with a few slides here. Again, there are models like USGS's COSMOS, Coastal Storm Modeling System, and NOAA's Sea Level Affecting Marshes model, the SLAM model. And what you see here is a capture of the Del Mar area with 1/2 meter, 1 meter, and 2 meters of sea level rise. That is simply what those elevations of waters would inundate. And that's from a website, Our Coast, Our Future, and you can see the link there below. Now here this is the 1/2, 1 meter, and 2 meters, sorry, the top is 1 meter with the 10-year storm, the 20-year storm, and the 100-year storm. And below is the 2-meter scenario with a 10-year storm, a 20-year storm, and a 100-year storm. And as you can see, large part of Del Mar almost becomes an island. So this is what we are up against, and what our actions are, and what scenario we actually experience depends on our actions now. Intense storms. So we have seen these things like Hurricane Hillary coming through in the summer, or really intense atmospheric river systems like we had last winter. Now, I think we all can clearly imagine the impacts of storm surge or flooding. But there are some other things. Some of you may have seen a column in last month's Sandpiper that I wrote that indicates that out-of-season rain is one of the potential causes for the proliferation of tropical mosquitoes and the tropical diseases that those mosquitoes carry. So if we are seeing more intense storm activity out of season, we could be seeing a public health issue as well. Wildfire. As you can see, since 1950, the area burned by California wildfires each year has been increasing as spring and summer temperatures have warmed and spring snowmelt has occurred earlier. That's the California Air Resources Board. And of the 20 largest fires in California history, 8 have occurred in the past 3 years. This was published in 2020, so that would have been since 2017. This map from Ready San Diego shows our wildfire hazard severity zones, and Del Mar is abuts very high severity wildfire zone. There's almost no area really east of Interstate 5 that hasn't been touched by wildfire. And it's a hazard, a threat that is going to continue to face us. And so there's some less obvious hazards or threats like phenological shifts, changing migration patterns. Phenology is nature's calendar. Phenology is when the buds burst, when the plants bloom, when birds' eggs hatch, things like that. And if you start to get these things mismatched because they're happening too early or too late, then getting mismatched with the historical pattern, bad things can happen. You know, birds arriving or insects arriving before their nectar plants are blooming, or birds hatching without the right food to feed their chicks. So these phenological mismatches can have horrible cascading effects through the biological communities. So before I turn it over to other speakers, I want to say, even though we face a lot of hazards, a lot of threats, we also have a lot of opportunities right now. There are nature-based solutions, scalable nature-based solutions right in front of our eyes. Solutions to where we can contribute and increase blue carbon sequestration, expand habitat for those rare, threatened, and endangered species, preserve our biodiversity, and improve our water quality. And a few examples are the W19 San Dieguito Lagoon Restoration Project, just east of the freeway. The Fairgrounds has created a stormwater treatment wetlands project to clean its runoff before it ever reaches the lagoon. The Del Mar Fairgrounds South Overflow Lot, where we have restored wetlands, functional wetlands, where it was a parking lot. That's a nice recovery. And there are other options. If you're familiar with the Brigantine Basin, we could be setting the stage for sea level rise. We could be creating future area for wetlands where we know that what's currently wetlands will be subtidal. We can create some space for those marshes to migrate upwards. And so with that, I'll pass it off to our next speaker and take your questions at the panel.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan Applebaum. Okay, our next speaker is Bob Battalio from Environmental Sciences Associates or Applications, I can't remember which, but Bob's firm is they're coastal engineering experts, and they helped develop the City of Del Mar's sea level rise adaptation plan, and he knows everything there is to know on beaches and what's going on in our coastal area. So Bob, you're welcome. Come on up.
Thank you, Dwight. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. So as Dwight mentioned, I'm an engineer. My name's Bob Battalio. I've been practicing for something like 40 years now almost, and I'm licensed in multiple states. I work for Environmental Science Associates. I actually live up near San Francisco. We, ESA and I and others worked with the City of Del Mar and issued several reports between 2016 and 2018. A vulnerability assessment, looking at sea level rise in particular, geared towards updating the local coastal program documents, an adaptation planning document. Also, we looked at sand management to help build and maintain the beaches. So that's a third report. And we looked at the San Dieguito Lagoon River area and how wetlands habitats may evolve with a SLAM-like model that was mentioned earlier. So those reports are available, and I think you can get them from the city website. So I'm going to talk about impacts of climate change on coastal resources, including beaches and bluffs. And let's move on. Okay. So here's the presentation outline. First, part one is an overview of climate change and how it is likely to impact the coastal environment in Del Mar. This is really looking at the vulnerabilities. Erosion and flooding. The second part will be what can be done to address and adapt to these coming changes. So this is adaptation. So on part one, I'm going to cover a lot of things. I should say I have probably too many slides for my time slot, but hopefully, I'm an engineer, but we did a lot of work. And so this information will hopefully be useful to you as a resource. And and I'm happy to answer questions later. So I'm going to kind of go through things, and Dwight will probably tell me to stop when I run over time. But I'll be covering sea level rise, coastal flooding, beach erosion, bluff erosion, San Dieguito River flooding, lagoon impacts, flooding and habitat, property infrastructure impacts. So first, sea level rise. So when we did our work back 2016, the contemporary guidance was the National Research Council 2012 and the Ocean Protection Council 2013. If you look at the table, I don't know if I can get the cursor to, well, anyway, if you look at the table and on the bottom of the slide, under high sea level rise, we were looking at approximately 2 feet of sea level by 2050 and 5.5 feet by 2100. The 2018 guidance that the state put out has higher levels of sea level rise, more rapid sea level rise on the high-end curves. The more recent report, the NOAA report that was mentioned earlier, and potentially the state's update, which will be coming up in the next year or so, may be a little lower. So I think the high amount was engineeringly and public policy conservative, if not scientifically conservative. Those are kind of different perspectives, but anyway, I think it's still in the ballpark. So first of all, coastal flooding. These are images of historical flooding, and I somehow, when we got this, when I had this formatted, the captions were reversed. The upper right image is actually the 1983 El Nino storm damage, and the other two images are the 2016 El Nino photographs. And if we look at the lower right, I just want to point out that the wave run-up is deflected up by the seawalls, and it's kind of hard to read, but that yellow-orange arrow pointing to the top is pointing to the elevation of wave run-up that we call the total water level. And you note that that's pretty high. It's above the barriers. It's deflected up. Whereas when the water comes down and accumulates behind the seawall, the water level is lower. So it's just the way we look at things. There's a potential elevation, and then there's the landward extent and flood depth, and it's a little confusing. If you look at the left image, you can see that the water is higher than the wall, but the flooding is not, behind the wall is not as high as that water level. So just something to, if you look at flood maps. So here shows a FEMA flood map that was put out in 2017 after most of our work was done. And it shows 16 to 18 feet of total water level, that run-up elevation, compared to the crest elevations of the seawalls and barriers being 14 to 17 feet. So that means that in a 100-year event, you can expect the water to be higher than the walls and to come over the walls and produce some flooding. In our study, we used some different methods, and we came up with higher values. So if we look at the table in the upper right, if you look at a 10-year event, we came up with total water levels up to 22 feet. So the wave run-up depends on how you analyze it and how you handle things like dynamic setup and getting into the weeds. And I just want to show you the lower right diagram, which further explains this idea of the waves breaking off farther offshore cause the water level near shore to rise up. It's like a surge, a set comes in, it's what we call dynamic setup. And then that increased depth allows larger waves to break closer to shore, and then their wave run-up is amplified. And again, you can see that there's a projection of the slope, and the total water level is this theoretical potential. In reality, if there's not a barrier there, it is not quite as deep and flows in. The one point I wanted to make, let's see, I covered this except the last bullet. When you don't allow the shore to migrate, when you have a seawall, it's likely that the wave run-up will be amplified with sea level rise. So the total water level and the amount of flooding doesn't go up the same amount. It doesn't go up 2 feet with 2 feet of sea level rise. It can go up 6 feet. with 2 feet of sea level rise. There's an amplification factor that's nonlinear. So secondly, beach erosion events. There are several types of the causes for beach erosion. One is just simply a storm or big winter event. And this graph is some of the Scripps data that we selected and plotted that was mentioned earlier. And what it shows is a beach profile. So if you're looking sideways at the beach, you have on the upper left, you have it's up around elevation 10 feet above low tide. And as you move out to the right, you're down into the surf zone and it gets deeper. The blue line is 2015. Before that, 2015, 2016 cumulative erosion. And the orange line is in 2016 after it. And you can see the beach receded about 50 feet. And it actually came up a little bit, a foot or two. So that's usually considered a reversible event. You have a storm and then hopefully, or an event that causes erosion, and hopefully there's enough sand, and then subsequently the beach rebuilds. Another reason for beach erosion is what we call a sand deficit. And this brings in the idea of a sediment budget, which is one of the reports we looked at. So you have delivery of sand from inland, rainfall runoff, erosion of bluffs, and those are the yellow arrows that are pointing out to the ocean. And then we have sand transport alongshore by waves. Waves come from the northwest or from the south, and they move the sand back and forth. And you can have more sand coming into your area or more leaving your area. So then we draw these little red boxes, and we add up all these things, kind of like an accountant. We have so much sand coming in and so much sand going out. And if you think of the beach as a sand reservoir, if you have more sand leaving than what's coming in, then your beach erodes. And if you add sand, you can widen the beach. So that's what the sand budget and sand deficit. When we did that analysis, we came up with a number here that Del Mar needs about 17,400 cubic yards a year of additional sand to maintain the beach width. So you have a deficit now. I mean, that number is overly precise, but that's a ballpark number. Now with sea level rise, and this is the kind of third element that causes beach erosion, is as sea level rises, this wave-shaped shore, from the beach out to the surf zone, wants to move up. Because, the reason why we have a beach and why the beach is above the tide is because the waves push the sand up. So if you have a seawall or a barrier and the beach can't migrate, then the beach gets narrower. So those are the things that happen. Storm events, event erosion, lack of sediment, sea level rise. So with all this, we did an analysis of what we expect the beaches to look like in the future with sea level rise and the sediment budget. And we have a graph here, and the blue line is what we did, and then the orange line is what the USGS Cosmos modeling shows. And their model was was more detailed, so you have more fluctuations. But basically what the graph shows is beach width on the vertical axis. We assumed a 90-foot width initially. It diminishes to somewhere around a nominal zero beach width by 2060 to 2075. That's based on the high sea level rise curve, which is 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050 or so. So it's a little on the conservative side again, but that's what the two independent studies came up with, essentially. So bluff erosion. We all know this happens. Here's some more pictures of bluff erosion, again, 2016. So the idea is that, as was mentioned earlier, as sea level rises and maybe beaches get narrower, the wave run-up extends farther in, and it reaches the base of the bluff, and it rises higher on the bluff, and it rises higher more frequently, so you have more energy being dissipated on the toe of the bluff, which conceptually increases the rate of erosion. And so sea level rise can increase bluff erosion as well as beach erosion. Now on the image, the The red zone shows, starts with the existing bluff top crest and goes inland over a 100-year period with a projection of historical bluff erosion rates, no sea level rise. The yellow is the Cosmos modeling that shows the effect with 5.5 feet or so. I can't remember the numbers exactly, but with sea level rise. And the green was something that was available to us preliminarily from Cosmos. So there's a lot of uncertainty with projecting bluff erosion with sea level rise. We haven't had a lot of sea level rise in the last 5,000 years, so it's hard to calibrate or verify your projections. But anyway, there's a risk and a likelihood that with sea level rise, bluff erosion will increase as well. Okay, so San Dieguito River flooding. Here's a picture of 1980 river flooding at the fairgrounds and in the San Dieguito Lagoon River area. This was complicated by some reservoir management issues, but it happened. And then the other image is an older FEMA map that includes what is now older FEMA analysis of the San Dieguito River flood potential that's not been updated. So with climate change, we can expect, at least as I understand it, as an engineer from the scientific modeling, that we can expect precipitation intensity to increase. That's different than water supply. So we may still get less water for drinking and everything else in the year, but the precipitation intensity could increase, which translates to an increase in flow rate in the river. It's very flashy, and an increase in the water level, and which can increase flooding. So the bottom line is, if we look at that example at the lower bullet there, we estimated with high climate change, the more on the high curve scenario, that the 100-year flood level at San Dieguito is projected to occur more frequently by the year 2100, and it could be a 10-year event. So imagine that. Instead of having an event on average once every 100 years, it could be once every decade. Again, that's a conservative engineering perspective. Lagoon impacts. So this schematic on the right is from a paper that a colleague and I wrote a few years ago. But what it shows is, if you look at the lower right, there's a plan view, and this is just a schematic of the lagoon. It does kind of look like San Dieguito and some of the other lagoons in Southern California. But the idea is you have streams coming down, there's a low area where the water accumulates, there's a mouth or an inlet which has tidal flow and also sand deposits. If we look at that sideways and go to the top schematic, you can see like a cross-section through. And this is a condition when the lagoon is open. If you go down to the middle diagram, if you have low water inflow, and then the beach berm will not scour as readily, and the waves can build a beach, essentially, a beach berm or ridge, and close off the lagoon. Now, San Dieguito is managed so that doesn't happen, but the natural condition would be that that would happen. And one of the implications with sea level rise is that you get more sand depositing in the deep area of the lagoon, and the beach can build up higher. So that can cause flooding on its own. It can also take sand out of the system. And then the other, perhaps more important issue, which is alluded to earlier, is that the lagoon water level can go up directly with sea level rise, or if the lagoon closes and it's not managed like it is now, it could go up even higher than that. And that would convert the marshes, the vegetated wetlands, to open water and mudflat, intertidal mudflat, so it's loss of habitat. If there's space, as was mentioned earlier, then the wetlands can migrate and reestablish in adjacent areas like the fairgrounds or other places in one of the parking lots or something like that. So we did an analysis, which is a SLAM-like model, sea level affecting marsh model. And I'm not going to go over this, but there is a report that projects in this kind of simplified, quantified conceptual model how the habitats would change over time with different amounts of sea level rise. And just touching on property and infrastructure risks, so our vulnerability assessment was what you would call a planning level. It's not like a full detailed engineering level. And what you do is you take these exposure maps, like how much erosion you expect, how much flooding you would expect, and then you overlay those on assets, whether they're a building or infrastructure like sewer lines or whatever. And then you say, okay, well, if that asset is within the hazard zone, then it's potentially vulnerable. It kind of neglects some of the details about how a sewer line might be impacted by an occasional flood. It might not be impacted, but it might. Erosion is kind of a big one for almost everybody. If something erodes, that can be an issue. But the bottom line is of order of magnitude that we came up with about 2 feet of sea level rise, which again, at the time we did the study, was conservatively forecast to occur by 2050. There are a lot of assets in Del Mar that are at risk. That's kind of the punchline. Okay, part 2. Am I doing okay on time? Okay, thank you. That helps me. So now I'm going to talk about adaptation and what can we do about it, and hopefully this is good news. There are some things we can do. I'm going to talk about sand management, horizontal levee, beach and bluff erosion mitigation, and then some thoughts about how individuals can prepare for this bad news, if you will. So this is a very busy slide, but right now, the mouth of San Dieguito River Lagoon and into the lagoon landward is dredged, and the sand is placed on the beach, and that's been done historically. We talked about how there may be a need to move more sand with sea level rise because more sand will deposit. If you look at the table at the bottom right, the first row is the current need, and that's that 17,400 cubic yards a year I mentioned earlier to maintain the beaches in their present width, approximately, with no sea level rise. Now, if you look at the next row down, we quantified how much sand would be needed with sea level rise in addition to existing demand. And with 1 foot of sea level rise, the demand increases by something around 35,000 cubic yards. So that's 200% more than existing. 2 feet of sea level rise, 50,000 additional cubic yards of sand per year. 5.5 feet, something like 75,000 cubic yards of sand per year. So the total increases from 17,000, this is the lower row, to somewhere between 50 and 100,000 cubic yards a year to maintain the beaches. So anyway, but that can be done. I mean, there is sand offshore. Sandag has moved sand. Coarser sand is better. And we're still learning about how to do this. This is done a lot on the East Coast and other places, California less so. And there is federal funding, cost sharing for those types of projects. Now, these numbers presume that your neighbors will add sand, and so that the sand that you add at Del Mar just doesn't go to the other neighbors, and which isn't a bad thing, but it's more effective if the whole beach is widened rather than just one town within this littoral cell. And it doesn't reduce the need to raise your seawalls or something like that, because the beaches will be wider that'll dissipate waves. But the water levels will be higher in storms, so the waves can still reach the home. So here's a schematic that shows what I'm trying to say is that if you can't let the beach migrate in and you want to maintain your beach with sea level rise, you basically have to place enough sand to lift the beach. You just, at not just the beach, but all the way out to what we call the depth of closure, which is where the biggest waves break offshore. So that's why there's so much sand needed. You need like a cubic yard for every square foot of your beach, essentially. Something that we've done up in San Francisco Bay, and there's a number of projects going on up there, is what we call a living levee or horizontal levee. And one of the ideas we came up with in the adaptation plan was to build a levee, which is represented schematically by that yellow line along the bank of the San Miguelito Lagoon and River Channel. And the lower image shows a conceptual cross-section, actually from another reference, that kind of shows what this living levee is. What it is instead of just a narrow, very engineeringly efficient, steep-sided structure, you make a wide, flat, sloping structure, horizontal levee, if you will. And then that has the benefit of creating habitat within the intertidal zone and can dissipate high shear stresses and hydraulics. And also with vegetation, you get organic mass production, which can help the vertical accretion occur. So in a way, it's like we call that a living levee, because the plants actually can lift the elevation a bit and can compensate for sea level rise to some degree. And there's other benefits associated with the nature-based approach. It takes space, but it's being done in other places, and it might be worth considering. So I've only got a couple more slides here. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is how can each of us think about protecting our bluffs from erosion. I talked about waves, but then as speakers previously mentioned, bluff erosion occurs with saturation of the soils and runoff and what we call land terrestrial erosion processes. So this is a schematic that shows a typical kind of California uplifted marine terrace where you have soil layers, the lower layer being older sedimentary rock that's harder, the medium, the next layer up being somewhat harder, but younger and still erodible, and the top being fairly recently deposited seabed that's higher up. And then you can see the bedrock is cut by waves, and then there's sand that's moving around on top of that. So the first thing that can be done is to control surface runoff. And so that's where, it rains on your driveway and shoots off onto the bluff and can cause erosion and rilling at the top. So that rainfall runoff on the surface can be managed. The second thing is that when you water your yards or whatever, the water can seep into that upper layer and cause the soil to get a lot heavier, which can increase the shear stress in the soil and result in some sloughing and that type of thing. The other thing that can happen with water in that upper layer is it tends to flow down, hit the relatively impermeable old seabed, and run along that, and then daylight at the bluff, and you can probably see that if you walk along. Plants like it, that's not a bad thing, but that can cause piping and destabilize the upper part of the bluff as well. Vegetation can be helpful, it depends, but vegetation can certainly help mitigate wind-induced and rainfall impact type, or maybe even wave run-up type mechanical erosion. I can also add some weight, so you have to be a little careful with that. And then people accessing the bluff, if that can be controlled, you can limit the erosion that can occur with people walking on unstable areas. So this is my last slide. Just some thoughts I had in preparing for this. First, recognize that hazards are increasing and will likely be manifested by extreme events like those that occurred before, but more frequent and potentially more severe. Develop hazard mitigation plans. Hazard mitigation plans are a tool, and they kind of link to potential federal funding. to address these potential adverse conditions. Inspect, renovate, and maintain required protective devices, which can buy time for additional adaptation. Seawalls aren't the best thing. They're not that resilient, but they serve a purpose. And until we can figure out what to do, people probably need to maintain those and maybe renovate them. Add floodproofing, including protection of utilities and critical assets. Have emergency temporary evacuation plans. Emphasize actions that increase resilience for yourself and others. In other words, reduce negative feedbacks on hazards. Consider nature-based approaches which are more resilient but may require more space. And then, get flood insurance. I think the existing FEMA flood map, which I kind of didn't mention, is probably underpredicts the 100-year flood hazards. Not just Del Mar, it's in other places too. So you might want to get flood insurance even if you're not in the floodplain. Just think about that. And these pictures, this is me surfing in Pacifica, where I live, in front of the seawall. And I just felt like this sequence is kind of analogous to adaptation. The waves coming in and it's changing shape, and you have to adjust. You have to adapt to that, or else otherwise you wipe out, right? So kind of think about going with the flow and enjoying it, and to the extent you can, and think like a surfer. That's it.
All right, thanks, Bob Battalio. How about a big hand for all of our first panel speakers? Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to have a question and answer period for about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer if there are good questions. And after that, we're going to have a break. So if you're getting the call for a bio break, you can certainly go anytime you have to. But if you can wait for 15 minutes or so, we will have a break and you can have a snack. So let's invite the speakers from the first panel to come up. And if you would, pick a seat around the curve in the dais here.
All right, Larry. I would like to hear something about how we deal with conflicting legislation out of Sacramento. We're concerned about habitat and urban runoff and things like that, and yet we get regulations to tell us let's build more houses and let's make wider freeways. How do we cope with that? Let's get a straight story out of Sacramento.
All right, who wants to take that on? I see all the lights are up. Mark, why don't you take a crack at that?
I think there's a lot of good intention at the state level, but it's one size doesn't fit all, and so it's very important for community voices to speak up. And I think this is a ground up sort of approach is ultimately what's going to be successful. There's a certain point in your career where you either do math or you do social science, and I went off on this math path, so I don't have a lot of solutions for maybe Jonathan has a better take on that.
Jonathan, you're up. I know you have opinions on this, Jonathan, so share them.
Well, Sacramento, DC, both the federal and state government have representation in the form of California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps of Engineers. They have regulatory guidance and permitting that is supposed to streamline things. And the Multiple Species Conservation Plan, in particular, has been negotiated. The Department of Fish and Wildlife has already established what its boundaries will be. Like Crest Canyon will not be touched if it's included within the MSCP preserve. Same thing, the Army Corps of Engineers has a no net loss policy for wetlands. So anytime a project has to go through review, it has to get those agencies buy-off. And then when those agencies do their stuff, go through CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, there's a public notice and public comment period. And so you just have to remind them that their guidelines, their policies are, their laws and regulations are already established. And you can't go further than what the law allows, even if there's a well-meaning policy to try to, increase housing availability. So I hope that helps. That's what governs the wildlands and the urban wildland interface. So I hope that helps.
All right, thanks for that. Next question.
Peter Crampton. I know the focus is primarily on adaptation. Adaptation is something that Del Mar is going to have to do. Fortunately, we have the resources with which to adapt effectively, I hope. But if somebody could, mitigation has been largely untouched. And we obviously have a global problem. And so we need to get everyone in the world involved. And the question is, how can Del Mar be most helpful with respect to the politics of mitigation?
Okay, if nobody volunteers, go ahead, Ralph.
Well, yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I mean, as I said, I think the easiest way to make progress is support the renewable transition. So, I mean, I'm sure there's decisions that the town can make, but it's, the Del Mar is a pretty small unit. So probably it means teaming up with other communities and coming up with visions. Let me dispel one thought, and that is that, every time you fly in an airplane, you're burning tons of carbon. And if you look at how much carbon's on our landscape, it doesn't add up. So, I mean, locally. So it's going to be very hard to mitigate climate change by growing sagebrush, for example. I mean, so growth does take CO2 out, but the scale is wrong for a community like Del Mar to think about its landscape as being very important for actually absorbing carbon. It's important for all sorts of other reasons. Yeah, I mean, I have one thing I really wish that San Diego would move on, and Del Mar's a piece of that, and that's get serious about bicycles. I mean, I think there should be a vision for a freeway system for bicycles. I mean, everyone should live within a mile or two of a place they can get on a bike path that basically is unencumbered except for an occasional stoplight with traffic, free right away. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but I just think there ought to be a vision articulated and put out and say, this is what we need to aim for, even if it's going to take a long time to get there. Because biking is frustrating because the bike paths are where you don't need them, where it's already wide enough and it was easy to put paint, and then suddenly there's a place where it's a disaster and then you're on your own, right? And there's a lot of room there because we have a climate that's favorable. And we have e-bikes that allow us to go up hills. So 20 miles on an e-bike isn't that hard a thing to do. So, I mean, for example, a week or two ago, I was up doing a hike on San Elijo, and and when they did the freeway widening, they actually put a bike path under that enlargement. It's really beautiful concept. I don't know what's going to happen in Del Mar where they have the freeway there, but there's voices should be out there talking about that. So, I mean,
all right, thanks,
I'm sure there are better ideas out there.
Jonathan wanted to take a crack at that question too. Jonathan?
I also feel like a community like Del Mar can have a disproportionate impact by establishing itself as a leader in green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, so that other similarly situated communities in the county also, or throughout Southern California, also implement living shorelines, scalable practices to increase blue carbon. So our community leadership and setting a good example, I think, is one way to have an outsized impact.
Thanks for that. I got to take just a moment to say this building is sustainable. We have a state-of-the-art solar system, power walls in the basement. We can run it entirely off solar. We collect the rainwater and water the landscaping with it, and this building came in on time and on budget as a demonstration that you can do things sustainably, that are beautiful, and that are affordable. All right, do we have another question? Karen.
Thank you. Two questions. One's very quick. Show of hands by the panelists. How many of you are surfers? Okay. No, the second one. Biggest issue in Del Mar right now is tunnels. And I have seen nothing in the engineering of our tunnel plans about the integration of the tunnel construction to the offshore sand deposition problem. We're going to be a huge producer of sand and materials. And there's got to be pre-engineering of a project that will slurry those sands to the right places to engineer as much of it to go back as a replacement to handle exactly what the gentleman from ESA said. How much has been done even thinking of that? I've heard nothing about that.
And just for the record, the discussion about the tunnel is off the table for today from a standpoint of who wants a tunnel and who doesn't, but I understand your point.
There is the concept of opportunistic beneficial sand reuse from construction projects, and the bluffs do have sand in them. And it would make sense to me, to the extent that the material is sandy and consistent with the beach sediments, the beach sands, to use that, place that material on the beach. There are some concerns about the finer constituents, finer particles, the smaller particle sizes, and putting those on the beach. That's kind of an area of research and debate right now in terms of looking at things from a more multi-objective rather than a turbidity perspective only. Yeah, I think beneficial opportunistic reuse of the excavated materials might be worth looking at.
Anybody else want to crack at that one? Not next question. I saw one. Did you have one, Terry?
My question is for Mark, and really it's about our colleague Adam Young and his monitoring of the Del Mar coastal bluffs. In 2024, about 1.5 miles of new 10-foot tall seawalls are going to be built at the toe of the bluff and bury over 1 acre of square footage of beach behind them. How will this change the studies that you all are doing, and will you be going about monitoring and measuring?
The intention of those studies is not only to measure sort of the natural change, but also to evaluate adaptation strategies. So I think we have a long history now of what that beach looked like before the seawalls. We'll certainly be interested to see what happens when the seawalls go in.
Anybody else want to comment on that? If not, Carol Carriage, you're next.
Yes, I'd like to ask the oceanographers, please. The events this summer with Maui and then not too long ago with Acapulco have occurred out in the Pacific Eastern part of the ocean. And I'm wondering if there's circumstances that were similar with them, and if we have any kind of situation like that in our area of the Pacific Eastern section. Can we tell?
Yeah, I think that is a sort of emergency management question, thinking about scenarios that have not necessarily happened very often in the past. So that in the case with Maui, a lot of things came together to give that particular circumstances where it was dry, the winds were incredibly strong with that storm system. And usually when we think of storms like that, we think of heavy rain, we don't think of fire risk. But more and more, we're going to see these intense storms, and I think you're right. They're going to have multi-risk sort of scenarios that we need to get out in front of and start thinking about.
Bob.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I'm obviously not a scientist, but in the historical record, one of the largest storms in terms of wave height and wavelength to impact Southern California was somewhere around the 1930s. I can't remember exactly. And it's the largest estimated wave height and impacting Southern California. And it was a hurricane that came up from Mexico, a Chubasco, if you will, that impacted Southern California. So I've been interested in using that event in our statistical analysis of future conditions, and I've wondered if climate change, which can increase convective energy, may increase the probability of another one of those events occurring.
Anybody else? Jonathan? Okay, another question? Yes, sir, over here.
Hi, Randy Turner. Bob, nice wave. And this is directed to you since, change is inevitable, and that's what we're hearing, your work in San Francisco or what you've seen up there in these live levees, do you see that our coastal communities, not just Del Mar, but Encinitas, Torrey Pines, could be feasible and a benefit to really looking at your studies up in San Francisco further for our coastal region?
Just a comment on that. There are some benefits like nutrient recycling that's really kind of important in San Francisco Bay. So, and other benefits that I kind of didn't quite mention. But yes, I think the horizontal levee, living levee concepts are definitely worth considering. And there's a number of those projects going on in San Francisco Bay right now.
Quick comment on that. The city of Del Mar, we do have a contract with Moffitt and Nichol, and they are designing a living levee, just as Bob outlined, and we followed his recommendations. Jonathan, you wanted to comment on this one?
I was going to comment that there is substantial funding and resources available through grant programs to implement living shorelines, nature-based solutions. The proof of concept is pretty well established, and now there's funding out there. It's just getting on those applications and getting those awards.
Thank you. Karen.
Hi, I have two questions. How are earthquakes going to affect, our coastal changes, with the sea level rising, fault lines? Will they be affected by this and throw another problem into the mix?
Well, seismic events can result in, can trigger landslides and bluff erosion events. Most of the bluff erosion is manifested in events, local, abrupt, kind of evulsive events. There are places where seismic shaking can result in liquefaction and kind of a settling of sandy deposits. I'm not sure that's too big of an issue here. That's all I can think of.
Yeah, hi, Dolores Jameson. It seems like so far we've avoided the boiling water that Florida has been experiencing. And I was wondering if you could talk about the temperature of the water, and have we just been lucky so far, or is that something that you're concerned about, or do we have any advantages being on the Pacific coast?
We have a lot to be thankful for living on the Pacific coast. So natural upwelling on this coast means we have cooler waters offshore. That's why the coastal zone here is so pleasant. The offshore temperatures are tracking global temperatures. So when you hear about global warming, our waters are warming at about the same rate. So far, that has not translated into, I think, a disruption of our natural sort of coastal ventilation. But it is a concern going forward. The warmer it gets, the less and less the ocean can help us in ventilating the coast. And so it is part of the issue going forward. Florida is already experiencing that because they have much warmer surface temperatures.
Anybody else want to crack at that? Ralph?
Just one aspect is that the coolness of our ocean buffers a zone along the coast, but it doesn't buffer so much once you get further inland. So we will see increasing temperature contrast between those who live near the coast and those who live inland. And that'll have all sorts of impacts. And it also affects sea breeze and other things. So, but if you play out long enough, this is sort of beyond any kind of reasonable concern, the ocean will catch up. So that's a temporary phase while the land is warming faster than the ocean. Because it's like cooking a turkey. It takes a while to warm up a big thing. And the ocean is like a big turkey, right? But it will eventually get warm up too.
All right, thanks. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Hang on, put it on the mic so we get it recorded for the video.
This is sort of related to the same question. Two parts. First, this last summer, we saw so much morning fog. You know, the marine layer lasted all summer, and that usually doesn't happen. Why did that happen? And the second part is, hasn't the ocean warmed a bit so that some of the marine life, the fishes, hasn't that changed? Aren't we seeing a migration of fishes that usually were further south coming into our area, including sharks? Thank you.
All right, who wants to take that one on? Jonathan, I know you're thoughts on that.
I'll take the second part of that. Y'all can have it first.
All right. Okay. Mark, you look ready.
I think that's, it was a really unusual summer, as you pointed out, and I think they're still looking at it. They're looking at the data to try to figure out why that was so, because I don't think it was predicted. So I'm not sure the ocean state was such that that was anticipated, so more to learn about that event.
Anybody else? Ralph?
So sort of anecdotally, because I've lived here so many years, or I grew up here, the summers have been getting more humid. That doesn't necessarily make it more overcast, but I do remember summers back when it would stay cloudy through July. So that was not unheard of. The other thing is that generally there's been much less fog than there was, say, back in the 60s. So, I mean, the existence of the Torrey Pines there that live off this fog flow, they're challenged, I think, because there's less fog, not more fog. So it's generally gone in that direction. But there's something about off-season rain that's happening, too.
Jonathan.
As to the shifting ranges of various marine species, anecdotally, absolutely, we're seeing things in the telemetry data of the sea turtles. We're seeing occurrences of yellow-bellied sea snake, movements of jellyfish, which maybe we're not seeing like we used to, but once in a while we'll see a really significant arrival. So anecdotally, we are seeing that, and it is being monitored very closely. If you stick around later, you might hear a little bit about MPA Watch, Marine Protected Area Watch, citizen science that's allowing us to really get to the migrations of sea life in the region.
Ellen.
Okay, I have a question about the sand. So
putting all this sand on the beach. How much of an impact is this going to have
on the
Ellen. It's not going to pick up on the video.
Oh. How much of an impact is this going to have on the lagoon versus widening the beach? And are we going to be able to dredge enough to keep up with all this tons of sand that we're putting on the beach?
With more sand placement on the beach, we can expect the lagoons to trap more sand. But sand is regularly dredged from the lagoons and placed on the beach. So that just means, in addition to placing sand along the beaches, there'll have to be an increase in the lagoon dredging and placing of sand. We could go a little deeper than that and think about, do we really want to dredge the lagoons? Should we be doing that or whatever? I won't get into that, but there is some research that indicates that sand storage in the lagoons, it can buffer erosion events, after big river discharges and the like. So we are kind of still messing with the system, and so there could be further study and thought, I think, in terms of sand management.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that? If not, we've probably got time for one more question if somebody has one.
One comment on that question was just that there's also the issue of the sand going offshore and in some cases burying offshore ecosystems. And so there has to be some care with that as well.
All right, go ahead.
Hi, I think my question is probably mostly directed to Jonathan, but anybody else who can answer. And I think it might be something that other people are curious about. We own a property on San Diego Road and grew about 1,000 milkweed plants this summer and spring and donated them to the San Diego River Valley Project. But I'm curious because I see that these butterflies that are completely off season now are still flying around. I'm not sure if they're laying eggs, but they're still, normally this is not their time of year. And we're seeing other bulbs coming up in the fall right now that would normally come up in the spring. So my question is, what happens in the future? Is this just a one-off, and then does nature get back into its normal routine? And how does that work when you have such an off year?
My answer is, we don't know. There is precedent for monsoonal moisture. I mean, there's precedent. A lot of our plants, like the geophytes, the bulbs you're talking about, have a life history that allows them to kind of abort and conserve their energies for a future bloom. But if this becomes such a pattern shift, then all bets are off. Butterflies are normally monarchs are normally starting to reach the Santa Barbara area, the Santa Cruz area. They're in their wintering groves. This year, they may have had some more milkweed to munch for longer, and so they may be delaying their migration. Do they have a hedge against some kind of catastrophic event? No, they have a very dynamic population that can contract very quickly. But we've seen in the last couple of years it can expand fairly quickly too. But I wish I had a better answer than stay tuned.
All right, thank you all. Let's have a big hand for this first panel of speakers.